feel like I was aware that my family structure wasn't typical from like a pretty early age, because I think my parents proactively told me that. But I didn't have a sense of that as like any kind of a problem, or I didn't, have a sense that anyone else would have an issue with that when I was very young. I think my parents like made a lot of efforts to show me representation of other families. Like they were involved in making media about queer families. One of my dads, actually, who is an early childhood educator, would take existing picture books and he would kind of like collage over them to make the families queer. So he would like cover up a dad and make another mom. I love that. And he would, like change some of the wording in the books. So, and then he would come to my school and like read those stories to my classes. So he was like really making an effort, I think, to have there be representation for me. So it really wasn't until middle school that I started confronting homophobia like at school. And I went to a new school for middle school. It was a very homophobic environment, and I didn't tell anyone about my family for like all of sixth grade. It was this big secret for me. So that's kind of like my early memory of how that kind of shifted.
For me, it's like very based around the politics of the time, because I was born in 1999. And there were talks about gay marriage being legalized, and then living in Massachusetts, obviously 2004. They were suddenly like allowed to get married. My like memories related to that though are being curious as like a young child about like bumper stickers and like noticing like, oh, our neighbors have like this other guy's bumper sticker. Why? And my mom explained that like, they support them. And then why don't we? And like my question was, why don't we support them? The answer was, well, they don't support families like ours. And so I think like in that sense, I just kind of got this idea that like, oh, there are some people that are okay with families like ours and some people that aren't. And like we keep with the people who are okay, and then the other people are just like off to the side. And then my parents were always just like really politically active. And like I grew up around a lot of like more politically active people than even like queer people. And so I think that there was like a idea that like we were fighting for something, and in that you kind of like are automatically like put on a team in some ways, and like you want to move that team forward and also be like defensive of that team and like protect them. And so like those early memories swirling around there are like a lot of feelings of like defensiveness and like trying to prove that there was no reason to be on another side than our family.
Right. Totally. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. My family was also pretty politically active, and I was born in 93. So yeah, the whole like gay marriage fight was a big thing going on in my childhood. And I like remember going to a lot of hearings at the State House around gay marriage. And I definitely like vividly remember the night that the first marriages were happening in Massachusetts, because I'm also from there. Like being at Cambridge City Hall for that. Yeah, so I definitely resonate with that, like that my family was not only queer, they were like publicly queer in this way, and they were very like active in their community, and that was definitely a big part of my experience.
Yeah, mine started like that, and then we moved when I was 5 from Somerville to the suburbs. And I feel like when that shift happened, there was also this shift in mindset of our family that like now we were starting over and we could like just fit in with everybody else. And my parents stayed engaged with like GLAAD, and continued to like be politically active specifically for gay marriage. But I remember them having like you know, like campaign parties like at their house like in Somerville, but then like we were never surrounded really by anything like that like in where we moved. And I think defense went into like having my space at my house and being like, inside this house, like things are safe, and then when you leave the house, things are not guaranteed to be safe. Like it's not dangerous, but you can't be sure of anything, whereas when you're in the house, things are fine. So I feel like there's a very like stark contrast for me in between those two like spheres.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I don't feel like I ever directly experienced a lot of like criticism of my own family, or I don't feel like I lost friends because of having gay parents, but yeah, for me it was starting in middle school where I definitely felt like there was this big thing that felt dangerous to share, that felt like I didn't know how people would respond, and I didn't trust people with that information, and that felt like a really big risk. And it's interesting, like I think like some of my family members had, or maybe not family members, but like someone that I dated had been, someone that my mom dated rather, had been the victim of a hate crime. And, you know, it was like hearing some of these things that didn't necessarily make me feel unsafe, but did give me some inklings of the stakes of being gay in public or having a gay family in public. And one thing I do really remember is an article that was published, it was like an op-ed or something, published in the local paper, like going on and on about like how messed up the kids of gay parents would be. Like all this stuff about like how we'd drop out of school and we'd be addicted to drugs and we'd get pregnant in high school and like all these things.
And be gay ourselves.
Right, all of this. And I do vividly remember that. And seeing that and being like, whoa. And I do think that impacted me to some degree in my desire to be like that poster child syndrome of like, be a model student, be like, and I was, you know, it's like, I didn't do any drugs in high school. I got straight A's, like, you know what I mean? Like, and I do think part of it was in the 90s, yeah, trying to go against a narrative.
For sure. I feel like the narrative that I grew up around, because people were talking about gay marriage, with like gay marriage being legalized in Massachusetts in like 2004, and then obviously like 2015 like nationwide, but so states were legalizing it as I was like becoming a conscious person. And I think like the general attitude on queerness shifted from it being like maybe like an abomination and like needing people to be like, you know, away from everybody else, and more turned into something that was kind of like subversive and like ultimately like rooted in a lot of like sex. And as a kid, I was very like confused when I would hear references, especially to lesbians, like in media as I got older, and it wasn't just like the things that they had specifically curated like for me to look at. And like I Kissed a Girl by Katy Perry came out when I was probably like 10. And that song has so many lyrics in it about like, you know, people are gonna think this is bad, this is bad, this is crazy, this is wild, and this is really sexually explicit.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, the only thing that she's talking about is literally kissing a girl. And like, I see my moms do that.
Right.
It's not crazy, it's not gross, it's not even really like sexual, like it's just like an expression of familial love. And that to me, I was like so scared of the implications that would come with talking about queerness, because it had this whole other layer of like sexuality that me as a really, really young kid, like a preteen, like did not feel comfortable talking about at all, didn't want anybody to talk about my sexuality, didn't feel sexual myself because I was 10. And like in that way, I feel like I was really afraid of like the lesbian identity in some ways, and not just like queer in general, but there was such this like, oh, lesbians are crazy, and like, you know, they just want to have fun. Even like all queer people, I think in general, get that reputation of like partying and that kind of thing, and that's just like, that's great, and that is a part of gay culture, but it's not a part of necessarily like family culture, and that's what we were fighting for, like politically.
Yeah.
So to have all of this like other implications of sex come in was like just really confusing, and I wanted to be away from that as a kid.
Yeah, totally. Right. I do feel like being a kid with queer parents in that era in particular, there was like all of this pressure on our parents to be like wholesome and like familial, and yeah, and it's an interesting thing. A friend of mine who also has been a part of Collage, the way that they phrased it to me once was that we were a litmus test for our parents' humanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really felt that when they put it that way. I was like,
I felt that so strong.
yeah.
As an older sibling too, it's like something that I think I haven't felt like my younger sibling relates to as much. And I think like being the older one and you being like an only child, like you are the one. And I felt like, oh, I had passed some tests, so like that let my sister kind of be a little bit more free. But I never got away from that like feeling of everybody's looking at you and everybody's gonna judge you
Right.
based on these other things.
And it really was like that. Like there were
was,
yeah, us that I feel like I've heard from a bunch of collagers, like people were making like would come make documentaries about us,
Right.
because we were like some of the only ones.
Right, like our family was in the newspaper just
Right.
for being our family. That
Exactly.
was like,
Right. So I know, I think when I was born, there was like a whole thing in the newspaper.
yeah,
Well,
right.
it's kind of
And then that kid has to turn out okay in order to be.
proof.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes like with us as collagers, like we kind of straddle these like two extremes of like those of us who really went into like being the poster children and like had that pressed upon us, and then people who don't feel like they were like included into that and didn't feel like they like people wanted them to really be the face of the queer
Right.
movement, which I think is like probably all equally, if not like harder in some ways. Like I'm really glad that I figured myself out later, but I think that it's just an interesting like perspective. There aren't people in the middle who are kind of just like, oh, I could just be me and be whoever. Like it's kind of pushed us into different routes.
Yeah, definitely. Right. And there's, I think, like the families that were like the face of the movement looked a certain way, right? Like, probably mostly white lesbian family.
Yeah.
Is like what that was supposed to look like.
Yeah. I always felt like as the four of us, like all of us are white and being like upper middle class, and like I was born with really blonde hair and blue eyes, and I felt like I was always like showed off as like the little like doll that like went along with this like lesbian couple. Obviously not as a kid did I realize that, but like later on I'm like, oh, this is why, or this, it feels so important to do these things. Like maybe it's not just because I want to do them.
Right. Yeah.